Good morning, hello, and welcome to the Central Asia program here at George Washington University. My name is Aytolkin Kurmanova, and I'm very pleased to host today's seminar, which will explore the 15th and 16th century historiographies of Central Asia. And we were supposed to have two wonderful speakers today. Who would discuss this historical period in a kind of a coherent narrative, the art and culture of two dynasties, Timurids and Shaybanids. And as many of you know, the competition and struggle between these two dynasties was a remarkable period in Central Asian history and was very important for the region politics as well as societies and cultures. And so our speakers were supposed to talk about the interpretation of these legacies during the Cold War, compare and contrast the approaches of Russian language and Anglophone scholars. But unfortunately, our first speaker is not here yet, so we will the first speaker, Gulandom Yuldasheva, who was supposed to be presenting on the Timurid period of our discussion, is not here yet, but we hope that she will join very soon. And if that's the case, she will speak the second. If that's not the case, that we will have only one speaker today. And so I'm very happy to introduce our, for now, one and only speaker, Professor Jaimee Comstock-Skipp. She will discuss the Cold War scholarship on illustrated Shaybanid arts of the book from the 16th century Central Asia. So once again, welcome. We look forward to having a very good discussion today. Feel free to send the questions in the chat. We will, of course, have some time in the end of the discussion to answer your questions. And so let's start with Jaimee's presentation. I'm very happy to present Jaimee Comstock-Skipp. She graduated from the University of California, Berkeley with a BA in Islamic civilizations and the Arabic language. Her first MA program was in the history of art at Williams College in Massachusetts. She was a recipient of the Fulbright grant in Tajikistan, and there she learned Farsi and Tajiki. She received a doctorate degree from the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, and she wrote a dissertation about the art of the Abul Hayrit dynasty in Transoxania during the 16th century and their diplomatic exchanges between courts within Central Asia and the broader Turco-Persianate sphere encompassing Safavids, Ottomans, and Mughals. At present, Dr. Comstock-Skipp is a Leverhulme early career researcher at the University of Oxford, writing a monograph about Abul Hayrit manuscript arts. And I'm very happy to give a floor to you, Jaimee. You go ahead first.
Thank you very much indeed for this kind introduction. And ideally, Gulandom John will discuss the preceding dynasty, the preceding Timurid dynasty in the 15th century. But for now, I will be happy to cover the 16th. So I should say that my training is as an art historian, and specifically the arts of the book. It must be stated that books, however, are difficult objects to classify as artworks. They can be revisited, reread, reworked, added on to, painted over, and illustrated much later than when the textual components were penned. Illustrated Persian language manuscripts have been well researched, particularly those produced in centers now in Iran today, while governed by the 15th century Timurids and the 16th century Safavids. But less so are those in Central Asia across the 16th century. So this region I will refer to as Transoxiana, and this refers to the lands beyond the Oxus River. It was these Abulkhayrids, often called Shaybanids or Uzbeks, and I'll go into the nomenclature later on. It was this group who controlled the lands shown here in yellow, having conquered the Timurids and continuing to spar with the Safavids Iran for the entire 16th century. Most battles were concentrated in Khorasan, which is that the overlapping region between them. So on the screen are all these varying dynasties that came to and fell from power in this broader Eastern Persian, Turco-Persianate Islamic realm. But I should add that dynastic differentiation became markedly pronounced in the second half of the 16th century. So at the onset of the 16th century, we see a rift, a political rift between Iran and Central Asia. That is not so much a linguistic and certainly not a cultural rift, but very much one based on religiosity. So it's in this period, so 1500 onwards, that Iran became a Shiite state, which holds true today, and surrounding territories would remain majority Sunni. Empires of the early modern period are really fascinating subjects to study. The Ottomans in Anatolia, the Mughals in northern India, Safavids in Iran, and the contemporary Abulkharids in Central Asia really deserve to be, on par with these groups, despite having a smaller geographic expanse. So labeling their artistic productions as Abulkharid reflects greater accuracy than the existing nomenclature, such as Shaybanid or Uzbek, but this also hides other contributing production practices when a manuscript contains visual and textual components that are from different times and places. I'm going to elucidate this more later on, after having acquired a better familiarity with both the art materials and the Abulkharid dynasty. So I'm going to adopt a historiographical approach to dwell on how art historians have classified their painted manuscripts since the 1950s through more recent decades. So in essence, I'm contributing a study of a study to analyze how English and Russian-speaking academicians have situated the dynasty's arts in the trajectory of Persianate manuscript production in various ways, independent or underneath an Iranian heading. So from the outset, I should state that I have published an extended version of this talk, and you see it here. To those who are interested, feel free to download. It's in the Journal of Art Historiography. But I think it's a bit more fun to include lots of visuals, and I'm very happy to present this to you in oral form. So this geographic and ideological rift between Iran and Central Asia has its origins in the historical battles waged between the Safavids and Abulkharids at this geographic intersection, this Khorasan middle point in the 16th century. So I show you on the screen, this is actually from a Safavid Shahnameh manuscript of the 1520s, 1530s, but we see kind of playing out of real battles, these Safavid troops, but actual Iranian heroes from this Shahnameh epic, wearing this red baton in the turban, which is actually the headwear of the Safavids, and the Abulkharid troops wearing this kalpak. Anybody who's been to Kyrgyzstan or Tajikistan has probably seen this black and white headwear, which seems to really manifest Chingizid or Mongol descent, so very proud origins to Chengiz Khan. But these battles actually, so these battles that are, whether it's a mythical recounting or actual 16th century skirmishes, these also have importance with the great game struggles of the 19th century, in which there was, political wars between Russia and Britain, maybe, well, ideological, not so much physical in certain periods. But these are also related to so great game struggles, but also the socialist and capitalist rivalries of the 20th century. And even today, so this is an older 19th century cartoon in which, Persia or Iran is in between the British lion and the Russian bear. But even today, there is global competition and jockeying over Central Asia as of old. And so Central Asia is really nestled in between hegemons, so China, Russia, Iran, and India. And so often Central Asia is couched as being peripheral to these spheres and not a center in its own right. But this is where I would like to intervene. And so a dynastic descriptor for the Abulkharid group here scrutinized really warrants some clarification. So in essence, I'm kind of recentering Central Asia. So just as the phrase Persian miniature has lost any real meaning, and this is because it unfairly emphasizes a small-sized painting associated with the modern nation-state of Iran. So too might scholarship actually refrain from using the terms, Uzbek, Bukharan, or Shaybanid to categorize 16th century illustrated manuscripts and their makers, this political group in Transoxiana. And this is because the first political head of the Abolgherids, Muhammad Shaybani Khan, he actually begged not to be called Uzbek. So the appellation Shaybanid that has frequented scholarly literature, it actually applies to all the Mongol descendants of this certain Shiban, this grandson of Genghis Khan. So in essence, this term Shaybanid would cover all of the rulers of the Golden Horde. So this encompasses 1242 through the descendants in the 16th century, scattered across Khorazm, which is in Turkmenistan today, Siberia, and also Transoxiana, and even extending up to, I'd say, the Russian occupation, the Russian conquest in the 1860s. And so these various, Shaybanids or descendants through Juchi, through the son of Genghis Khan, it's really overly broad. And for this reason, since my focus is on 16th century, Abolgherid proves to be the proper term. A Persian language prose chronicle connects this the figurehead Abolgher Khan, who again is a descendant Genghis Khan, through Juchi, through Shiban, and then Abolgher. So he really helps consolidate group power, tribal power through, yes, these Uzbeks, but at the term that just referred to an Islamicized Mongol. And then he died in 1467, so it was his son, Muhammad Shaybani Khan, who was able to continue or really champion the conquest and defeat the Timurids. So we see here again this black and white headgear that I mentioned earlier that again is a manifestation of their Mongol roots. So the first city that Muhammad Shaybani Khan, Abolgher Khan's grandson, that he captured was Samarkand. And hopefully Gulandom will discuss this further. But this had been one of the seats of Timurid power, but in defeating the Timurids in Samarkand, the great Khan, or the first, or the main ruler of the Abolgherid polity, who was usually the oldest living descendant to Abolgher Khan, would sit in that political center. But power was also distributed in Tashkent, Balkh, Bukhara, and Herat when they were able to take it from the Safavids. So the Abolgherid administrators really had much in common with these other contemporaneous realms overseen by Persian language administrations, so Safavids, Ottomans, and Mughals. And so they all produced manuscripts in Persian and Turkic variants. I think actually I should skip ahead here to, well, this is just a slide to show that, Safid Iran has gotten a lot of attention. It's been called Perso-Islamic, whereas the Abolgherids are associated more with Turco-Mongol decentralized power. But I make the claim that centralization actually happened a bit earlier in the Abolgherid sphere. We see here a capital shift in 1583, stimulation of trade, actually preceding the Safavid political sphere by a few decades. But that's just kind of to snub the Safavids. Let's forge ahead to get into this term, the Bukhara school, because this has been used to refer to the manuscript arts of the Abolgherids. Museums and libraries in the world today have often eclipsed and elided the nuances of Abolgherid book arts by ascribing them to this one school, this one site of production. And so underlined in red, we see here that, this has been labeled 16th century, Shaybani, at least they kind of get that specification, but they associate it with Bukhara. Whereas if you look at the date, this is actually too early to be attributed to Bukhara, at least the text. So the text was written out earlier, the illustrations were added decades later, but you would never get this just if you go on the textual scribing of the work. Or here, this is a bit So it's a complicated painting because I guess scholars have looked at it and thought, okay, it must be Safavid, must be Iranian because of the turbans or whatnot. But in actuality, I really detect some parallels to indeed a manuscript painted in Bukhara. And so I have a feeling that there's some overpainting going on. So it's one thing to, associate everything with Iran simply because it has the proper headgear, but you really need to look at all layers of an artwork to determine how it was made. So I think, again, I should kind of skip over some of this. This is just to show you that there is indeed artistic production in Tashkent, which does not get much attention. This, again, has a layered process of production written out in 1514 in Herat, later illustrated in Bukhara. And so this is quite common, actually, across the 16th century that you have leftover manuscripts being picked up to then be finished decades later. So in Abulcaid manuscript productions, we frequently encounter these cross-dynastic transfers, and actual artisans and scribes are going back and forth across the realms. And so it makes sense that, how would you classify these things? And so as a result, Abulcaid manuscript arts really occupy a curious position in scholarship. They're really kind of trapped between ethnic and linguistic labels. And so at times they're considered, too Turkish to be categorized alongside other Persianate dynasties. But also they can also be called too Persian to be grouped with, for example, the arts of Turkic speakers, Ottomans, Turkmens. And so instead, they've been compared and contrasted to Timurid and Safavid manuscripts. And so several art historical models have really swallowed up Abulcaid materials within chapters on contemporaneous Safavid arts, or they're really looked at as a dying echo of late Timurid painting in Herat. So we've kind of seen these shifting borders. So during the Timurid dynasty, this was the last time that Iran and Transoxiana, or I should say Eastern Iran and Transoxiana, were administered by the same power, because then once you get to 1500, we see this split. The perceived factionalism, so, this perceived difference between Iran and Central Asia really recurs in all historical periods, even before Islam entered the area in the 7th and 8th centuries. So this has really been contested, this question of degrees of Iranian influence, political and artistic, over Central Asia. And so even in pre-Islamic polities and visual forms, we see this at play in the scholarship. So these really scholars have contested that at least this difference between Central Asia and Iran is a question of two different political contexts: the powerful centralized organization of the Sasanian Empire, so the pre-Islamic dynasty that was administering Iran, versus the scattered Sogdian city-states, so these located in today's Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. So Soviet archaeologists in the 1950s were excavating Sogdian materials. And so despite acknowledging the presence of many and complex influences, Soviet scholars were really prone to consider Sogdian art as an independent and local tradition. And so it was this group that would then exert a westward influence from Central Asia onto medieval Iranian artworks. And so this contrasts Western art historians absorbing Sogdian material culture under a broader Sasanian, so pre-Islamic Iranian banner. So to them, the Sogdian murals and paintings from Central Asia are samples of late Sasanian provincial art production, manifesting a previously unknown pre-Islamic stage in the development of Iranian painting. And so it seems like both cases, though, are a bit unfair in really, essentializing these objects. So royal and imperial carved silver objects from the former palaces of Iran on the left, as opposed to non-royal, painted interiors of private homes in Central Asia on the right, were being conflated and, put alongside each other when it's kind of like comparing apples and oranges. So let's look at Let's look at what's happening with analysis of later manuscript paintings from the 15th and 16th centuries, so squarely in the Islamic period. Historians writing in English have opted to group Abulhadid manuscript arts under a broader Safavid heading, while Russian-speaking scholars have more stridently championed Central Asian artistic variants as local innovations independent of Iranian influence. And so as a case in point, let's see, as a case in point, I want to show you, let's see, the works of Lawrence Binion, Wilkinson and Gray. And so this is published alongside a great exhibition of Persian painting, Persian art, as it was called in London in 1931. But we see how, Bukhara miniatures are under this early Safavid heading. Later on, this is from 1958, a scholar, Basil William Robinson, curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum, had different publications, but we see here how Bukhara on the left is under a provincial style, and on the right, Bukhara style is definitely fair and square under the Safavid. So in one of his publications, he has this schematic of what he calls Persian painting, and so focusing in on the Safavid period, we see this tiny little offshoot of the Bukhara style, as if Bukhara was the domain of the Safavids when it never was. And so we see on the bottom actually that these are illustrations that are not necessarily from Bukhara per se. The one on the left might be a very early Shahnameh illustration from around 1500, perhaps from Herat or Samarkand, when the Abulhadids or Shaybanids took over power from the Timurids. And then on the right, again, this is an earlier manuscript written out in Herat, but illustrations were added later in Bukhara. So let's turn to the Russian-speaking sphere. In articles written in the 1950s, academicians in the academies of sciences in the Soviet Socialist republics, such as Galina Pugachenkova, Olimpiada Galerkina, they instead used the terms Sredny Aziatskoy, or Central Asian, or Malvaronarskoy, or Transoxianan, when they treated Abulhadid manuscripts. And so these art historians, Pugachenkova, Galerkina, stridently criticized the placement of these arts under Iranian headings. And in some articles, it's actually quite amusing when they accuse foreign scholars, implying inhabitants outside of the USSR, specifically English-speaking capitalist scholars, of not understanding the schools of manuscript painting in Transoxiana, and instead articulating, quote, their bourgeois point of view. And so these assertions of artistic independence from Iranian forms is really, really telling. And I actually must confess that I do respect their insistence on this rhetoric of like indigenousness, regional character, a demarcation of cultural forms through difference. But I would say, I mean, we also need to acknowledge that there is, an influx of artists, or artisans move around, and we can't really pinpoint them to any one region. Again, we see here, the difference between these two that are more, geographically titled in the Soviet period scholarship. And I'm also mindful of the time, and so I should say that it was important in the Soviet period to not focus so much on crafting this anti-Iranian stance, or because there was a threat of kind of stirring up, pan-Persian fraternity, camaraderie. And so we know in the Soviet period that, kind of division or ethnic demarcations was a bit key to maintaining cohesion. So it's worth questioning, what was the overarching Soviet viewpoint of Transoxiana when it was administered by the Abulhadids? So before 1991, Moscow was reticent to valorize the past rulers, and so instead had written off, Abulhadids, Shaybanids as nomadic, feudal, backwards, and this was to downplay any positive contributions to the region that the Abulhadid group had administered centuries ago. So nonetheless, the Abulhadids were not altogether ignored, and were indeed quite useful for Soviet determinations of ethnogenesis. So this term refers to, the formation of an ethnic group. And so the Soviet agenda really sought to mobilize historical figures to craft a past narrative for each Central Asian republic. And again, this is part of the dividing up, and to kind of divide up and well, to decapitate an interconnected cultural heritage and produce a segmented and sectioned out national history that really justifies and legitimizes national border demarcations of the individual republics. And so these Soviet scholars really spearheaded Alexander Semyonov, who claimed that the conquest of Transoxiana was by a confederation of, Uzbek tribes. So this is important to the nation, but, the dynasty was then presented as being, unique and independent from other developments in Iran. But there's also some complications because the Soviet scholars could not be too laudatory because of the Abukharids' ancestors in the Golden Horde, and it was this group that had actually attacked the historical lands of the Rus. And it was kind of a state aim to present a conflict-free historical background to the relationship between the people of Turkestan and Russia. So this is to kind of perpetuate the illusion of their continued coexistence. And also, I should add that the Abukharids, Mongols were associated with being nomadic, feudal, less developed than their settled counterparts. So I think I should skip ahead a bit. And this is just to state that, Navoi, whom Gulandom will hopefully discuss more, he was really praised as being, proto-socialist. We really see kind of a workers of the world unite resonance in the 16th century illustration on the left. And again, this kind of lauding of the workers in some of these Central Asian manuscripts, when indeed, you do have these across this very wide, broad tradition. I think I need to skip over a bit here, but just to show that, these two rival opinions, if you will, between Anglophone scholars, Russian scholars, it's uncertain, why they develop these different viewpoints. In that, the on the Anglophone side, they really kind of insert Central Asian arts under an Iranian heading, and in the Russian-speaking sphere, it's very much isolated and independent of Iran. Current events in the world may threaten to return us to the rigid geopolitical spheres of the 1950s, which is very much the case, these two scholars here. But studies can continue to progress through collegial dialogue and accessing findings and materials in all corners of academia and the globe. Intriguingly, it was only after the breakup of the Soviet Union that this Basil William Robinson in 1991 acknowledged Pugachenkova's Miniatures of Central Asia book that was originally written in 1979. Before the 1990s, English and Russian-speaking researchers were writing in parallel on the same Abulkharid dynastic arts at the same time in the mid-20th century. However, due to impediments of language or politics, they do not seem to have been communicating with each other at this time. So having operated in two different geopolitical spheres, the USSR and mostly the UK, with limited porousness over the decades, it is understandable that these scholars came up with different classificatory schema to treat Abulkharid painted arts. They might have reached their separate classificatory conclusions based on the materials available to them. And so seems to be the case more that in the Soviet sphere, they had intact manuscripts. They were able to treat them as complete objects, which offered a more nuanced understanding. Whereas in the West, yes, they had some intact manuscripts, but lots of ripped out loose pages that were devoid of contextualization. So they kind of crafted this more aesthetic approach. So I want to close with the state of these arts right up to the present and even the future. Dynastic borders take different forms that differ from current nation states, and some dynasties have been getting associated with national narratives more than others. Art is frequently co-opted to make nationalist and political claims of sovereignty, group affiliation, and exceptionalism. Manuscript arts of the early modern period have become charged with the concerns of the modern present. We see how the appropriation of these cultural forms from select dynasties have been used to secure political legitimacy. This is taking place. Several nations within the Turco-Persianate sphere are harnessing artistic heritage and mythologizing history for present politicizing, legitimizing, and nationalizing aims. Uzbekistan, note the book on the far right, is currently extolling the refinement of the Timurids, India, the Mughals, for their literary and cultural legacies, Turkey, the Ottomans, for the might of their empire, and in Iran, it's the Safavids that are being promoted for their Shiite proselytization. So the Abulkhayrids are really, in comparison, they're out of the picture and really on the margins. They're not quite forgotten, but they are awaiting their full day of recognition. But in current Central Asian states, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, somewhat, they're really starting to take note of Abulkhayrid artistic heritage for their legitimacy and nationalizing aims. So on the screen, we see various book series, including a group published in Kazakhstan, that is in the center. Tajikistan has this series on the left, Khorasani Bozorg, and Uzbekistan on the right. And so this burgeoning interest in the Abulkhayrids underscores the importance of teasing out the cross-cultural and trans-regional factors shaping their original traditions. One nation state can never own them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Jaimee. Thank you. That was really very interesting, very fascinating. And I think that we will have a lot of questions because the topic is really interesting. And I again encourage all our participants to send the questions in the chat so that we can have a lively discussion. And I think we do have Gulandom back. The connection was a little bit unstable, so Gulandom disappeared for some time, then she is back. So I hope that she can present. Just
Yes.
wanted to make sure. Yes. Hello. Yes. Welcome,
Hi.
Gulandom. Yes. Just a second. I wanted to make sure that your connection is stable and that you're ready to speak. And I
Yeah.
just wanted to present you too. We know you, Gulandom Yuldasheva, as a scholar, specializing in Turkic literature, Islamic history, and the cultural legacy of Central Asia. She earned her Bachelor of Arts degree in Turkish Studies and the Russian language from Tashkent State University, Uzbekistan, where she also completed her master's degree in Islamic history. And following her graduate studies, she worked extensively at the Institute of Oriental Studies named after Biruni under the Academy of Sciences of Uzbekistan, focusing on Turkic literary manuscripts. And currently, Ms. Yuldasheva is a PhD candidate at the Tashkent State University of Oriental Studies, where her dissertation explores the Timurid Renaissance in the 15th century Herat. Gulandom, you're very welcome to speak now. And again, please send the questions in the chat. We hope that we'll have some discussion. Thank you, Gulandom.
Thank you. Let me share this first. Is it visible now, my presentation? I mean, my paper?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. Hello, how is everyone doing? Hi, it's from eastern coast of United States. I'm from Virginia, doing my research on the 15th century Timurid Herat, and today's presentation called The Timurid Renaissance Revisited, Soviet and Western Historiographies of Alisher, Navoi, and the Timurid Period. So I got a little bit change of the topic of the title, but we will be discussing how Timurid scholarship developed and flourished in the West versus how it was distorted in the Soviet Union. So the 15th century Timurid Renaissance in Herat represents a transformative era of cultural, intellectual, and artistic flourishing in Islamic Central Asia. This period, centered around the court of Sultan Hussein Baqara, was built upon foundations laid by earlier rulers, including Amir Timur and his son Shahrukh. So as we saw from amazing presentation by Jaimee, all the flourishing in Transoxiana and Khorasan came from the Amir Timur's built a powerful empire in Samarkand. So Amir Timur was a powerful king who did a massive conquest around Central Asia, Caucasus, Iran, Afghanistan, Iran and India. So he built his capital in Samarkand, and from all his conquest lands, he brought very talented craftsmen and architects to build his capital in Central Asia. A central figure of this cultural flowering was Alisher Navoi. So now we're coming back. Now we're going to the last Timurid, Sultan Hussein Baqara, who was the fifth generation of Amir Timur, and in his sultanship of Herat, there was a very big renaissance that was started during Amir Timur, and then during Hussein Baqara, that was the culmination of that renaissance. The celebrated poet Alisher Navoi, statesman and scholar whose literary and philosophical contributions helped define the intellectual and artistic character of Timurid Herat, will be our central figure today. The cultural radiance of Herat extended its influence in the Shaybanid Abul Hayrid power, as Jaimee talked in her presentation, in Herat and Samarkand, as well as beyond Khorasan, shaping the courts of the Safavid dynasty in Iran and leaving a profound imprint on the Mughal Empire under Padishah Babur. Political stability, economic prosperity, and enlightened patronage converged to produce unprecedented achievements in literature, the arts, architecture, and intellectual discourse. This paper examines the foundations and evolution of the Timurid Renaissance, the role of key cultural patrons, and resilience of Timurid scholarship, even in the face of suppression under the Soviet regime centuries later. Amir Timur of Shahrisabz in present-day Uzbekistan established an empire that stretched from the Volga River to the Indian subcontinent and from Anatolia to the borders of China. His capital, Samarkand, became a hub of monumental architecture, scholarly inquiry, and artistic innovation. Timur's court attracted architects, engineers, polymaths, and theologians who collectively fostered a vibrant environment, intellectual milieu. This synthesis of inherited Islamic traditions and innovative artistic expression laid the groundwork for what would later flourish in Herat. So basically all Timurid princes, those are four sons of Timur, his grandson, his great-grandson, his great-great-great-sons were artistically talented people. They were poets, they were calligraphers, they were a fan of architecture. So they built such a beautiful fine arts and architectural complexes that is still living today in Samarkand, in parts of Herat, and in Iran. I believe Jaimee visited Iran, and she saw how Isfahan's and Tabriz beautiful architecture is still dazzling today. Following Timur's death, the political center shifted to Herat under the rule of Shahrukh. Shahrukh was Amir Timur's son. Shahrukh was certainly a patron of scholarship, a bibliophile who played a critical role in transforming the city into a major cultural and intellectual center. The reign of Sultan Hussein Baqara marked the zenith of the Timurid Renaissance. so Shahrukh is his uncle. So Sultan Hussein Baqara is taking power in 1469 with a great success and becomes Sultan of Herat. Central to the intellectual and spiritual vitality of this court were two towering figures, which was his childhood friend, Sultan Hussein Baqara's childhood friend, Alisher Navoi. And they grew up together, they went to school together, and they were very close intellectually and morally, and I want to say spiritually. So Alisher Navoi studied in different parts of Transoxiana and Khorasan, but when Hussein Baqara came to power in 1469, he called his friend Alisher Navoi from Samarkand to come and to become his emir, which is his like, I want to say prime minister. And Abdurrahman Jaimee, who was a teacher of Alisher Navoi and spiritual leader, he was a Naqshbandi Sufi order. He was a person who held Naqshbandi Sufi order, and he was a very influential figure in the Timurid Herat of that time. Together, Navoi and Jaimee cultivated an environment in which scholars, poets, and artists could collaborate freely, fostering a vibrant and enduring cultural synthesis. Under the patronage, Timurid Herat became a hub where literary creativity, Sufi thoughts, and aesthetic innovation intersected, producing works that not only advanced Persian and Chagatai literature, but also embedded spiritual and moral values into the broader intellectual culture of Central Asia. As we saw from Jaimee's presentation, Persian literature and Persian literature and language was influential in medieval Central Asia and Iran's life. Chagatai literature, on the other hand, was the local Turkic language of Central Asia. I want to say Mawara un-Nahr, but it was not that influential in the writing style or in the poetry or Khamsa. So during Alisher Navoi, Chagatai literature, which is Old Turkic literature, Old Turkic language, became very prominent and influential because he started using Chagatai language instead of Persian. The collaboration between these two towering figures exemplifies how political and spiritual patronage together could shape a culturally and intellectually flourishing society whose influence endured long after the decline of Timurid political power. As Dr. Maria Subtelny from Toronto University has emphasized, this flourishing extended beyond aesthetics. The patronage of literature and the arts functioned as a means of legitimizing political authority, shaping communal identity, and embedding ethical and cultural values within the framework of governors. Hussein Baqara's court became a nexus for manuscript production, music, poetry, and the visual arts, supported by a sophisticated system of endowments that strengthened the cultural and intellectual fabric of Khorasan. So during Hussein Baqara's time, there was a Kitabkhana, which is a royal library or royal courtly workshops where artisans and scholars and craftsmen and bookbinders and all these beautiful people of fine arts worked and produced lavish manuscripts. The Timurid Renaissance was distinguished by remarkable accomplishments across multiple fields in the fine arts, calligraphy, miniature painting, and ornamental design, attained new levels of refinement infused with both spiritual and cultural symbolism. Architecture, marked by grand complexes and monumental structures, required the collaboration of mathematicians, engineers, and designers, leaving an enduring architectural legacy that continues to inspire. Literature flourished through the contributions of figures such as Navoi and Jaimee, who expanded the horizons of Persian and Turkic literary traditions. So Abdurrahman Jaimee was Persian polymath and Sufi literary figure, versus Navoi came from the Turkic background, but he fluently spoke Persian and Turkic and Arabic, as was, normal for those days. And he wrote in both Persian and Turkic languages. I'm going to skip a little bit because we probably have less time. Now we're going to go to Soviet regime scholarship. Despite the enduring legacy of the Timurid Renaissance, the study of its leading figures, particularly Navoi, suffered severe repression under Soviet rule. Scholars such as Hamid Suleiman, who played a critical role in developing the manuscript holdings of the Abu Rayhan Biruni Institute of Oriental Studies in Uzbekistan, and Ergash Rustamov, whose major work, Uzbek Poetry in the first half of the 15th century, illuminated the history of Uzbek literature, faced imprisonment and persecution. Similarly, Baturkhan Akramov was expelled from Tashkent State University for teaching Navoi as a follower of the Naqshbandi order. Despite their dedication to preserving and studying the spiritual and literary heritage of Islamic Central Asia, these scholars were silenced by Uzbek officials of the same institution loyal to the communist regime. The Soviet regime's militant atheism and systematic suppression of religion dismantled centuries-old traditions of Islamic learning, shuttered mosques, and disrupted spiritual networks. As wrote Adib Khalid, all forms of Islamic expression came under sustained assault in the Soviet period. Patterns of the transmission of Islamic knowledge were damaged, if not destroyed. Islam was driven from the public realm. The physical marking of Islam, such as mosques and seminaries, disappeared. As we can see, Soviet atheistic regime didn't want anything related to Islam or beliefs or any religion practices to be involved in the scholarly world. So they tried to erase everything that was related to the religion in this particular subject to Islam. Yet the perseverance of the scholars, along with the revival of historical research after Uzbekistan independence, demonstrates both the resilience of intellectual inquiry and enduring relevance of the Timurid cultural legacy. So Dr. Subtelny deeply describes influence of Alisher Navoi in Abdurrahman Jaimee and Zahiruddin Muhammad Babur in Sultan Hussein Baqar's court. Babur was his cousin, but he was the establisher of Mughal Empire. From his memoirs, Baburnama, which was also written in Chagatai Turkish, we learn how flourishing and beautiful was Herat at the time of Sultan Hussein Baqara. I'm gonna skip a little bit. Scholars such as Vasily Vladimirovich Bartold, Evgeny Eduardovich Bertels, Alexander Semyonov, while making important contributions to the study of Central Asian history and literature, nonetheless worked within the framework of Marxist-Leninist historiography and thus served the ideological needs of the Soviet state. Their works often presented the medieval Islamic past of Central Asia, including the Timurid period through the lens of class struggle, feudal decadence, and the supposed progressive role of Russian and Soviet modernization. This interpretive paradigm, while producing a substantial scholarly apparatus, ultimately reduced complex cultural and spiritual phenomena to materialist categories. So Vasily Vladimirovich Bartold was an amazing polymath scholar who studied the history of Central Asia, history of Sogdiana and Balkh, and he studied all the Turkic nationalities, ethnicities, the languages, and his work was fundamental in Soviet era, about Navoi, about Timurid Renaissance, to shed light on the rich history of Central Asia. So all the Soviet scholars who involved in the Timurid era, in particularly Sultan Hussein Baqar's era, addressed their interest in Bartol's work. His school produced many exceptional Soviet scholars, such as Evgeny Eduardovich Bertels. He also was an amazing scholar who produced manuscripts about Abdurrahman Jaimee and Navoi. He also wrote about Sufism, but how Dr. Mark Tutan tells us, Bertels and Simeonov set the tone of the Soviet ideology to put Alisher Navoi as a hero for Uzbek nationality. So scholarship on the Timurid legacy, while undeniably rich in detail and invaluable in preserving sources, was reframed through Marxist-Leninist ideology. The Timurid era was often depicted not primarily as an autonomous cultural renaissance, but as feudal stage whose progressive elements could be reinterpreted as precursors to socialism. Unfortunately, Navoi was not a spiritual leader of Sultan Hussein Baqar's court. He was only a vizier, or the right hand of Sultan Hussein Baqara, and they were depicted movie. There was a movie depicted about Alisher Navoi and Sultan Hussein Baqar's relationship, showing them as rivals because Alisher Navoi fell in love with Abdurrahman Jami's, ideological woman. So those kind of misinterpretations went through this 90 or 80 years of Soviet regime, and we only learn about Navoi as a poet and as a court statesman, but there were so much to learn from the manuscripts that were revealed later on. Simeonov was another talented Oriental scholar whose works also helped Uzbek scholarship in the Soviet era to identify the nuances of Alisher Navoi's manuscripts and his period. So I want to go to Dr. Tutan's observations, where he points to the central paradox of Soviet-era scholarship on Alisher Navoi. On one hand, he was elevated as a founder of Uzbek literature and a symbol of Uzbek national identity. On the other, the core of his intellectual and spiritual world, his Sufi orientation and religious convictions, was systematically erased. By foregrounding Bertels and Borovkov's framing of Navoi merely as a progenitor of old Uzbek literature, or as we said, Chagatai literature, Soviet propaganda succeeded in producing a carefully secularized version of history. In this narrative, Navoi's value lay not in his engagement with Islam, Sufism, or the moral philosophical depths of his poetry, but in his service to nation building through language, literature, and culture. Dr. Tutan brings a very important point about scholar Natan Malayev, who was an amazing professor of Uzbek literature, that he showed Navoi and his time and Uzbek literature as a source of socialist ideology. But I want to point out to one interesting interview that I had with his former student who had his name is Mr. Oktam Narkulov. By Mr. Narkulov's statement, Dr. Malayev was I'm gonna find, here you go. Yet the story was more complex behind the official facade. My interview with Dr. Malayev's student, Mr. Oktam Narkulov, provides a rare glimpse into this hidden intellectual life of the 1960s and 70s of Uzbekistan. Mr. Narkulov's testimony suggests that Malayev himself, despite being a prominent representative of official Soviet literary historiography, privately preserved and valued the very works that were forbidden by the regime. The secret library hidden behind his living room wall, filled with banned manuscripts of Cholpan, Qadiri, Mahmud Khoja Behbudi, Usman Nasr, Ibrat Khoja, Munawar Qara Abdurrashid Khanov, Mullah Qoshmat, Elbek Batu, and other Jadid writers, who were a group of reformist intellectuals, writers, teachers, and social activists in Central Asia, particularly in Uzbekistan, during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, reveal the duality of a scholar living under censorship, public conformity versus private guardianship of intellectual heritage. By granting his student access to these materials under the condition of secrecy, Dr. Malayev not only risked persecution, but also affirmed his commitment to safeguarding Uzbek cultural memory in its unexpurgated form. So when I spoke to Mr. Narkulov, he said Natan Malayev was exceptionally talented scholar in Navoi on the classical literature of Turkic languages. He knew Arabic and Persian and Turkic. So that being said, he was forced to serve the Soviet military regime, I mean, atheistic regime, to survive. And you can imagine how much authenticity is lost from this scholarship. If the ideology didn't force people to write for their needs, all this amazing Timurid Renaissance contributors, Alisher, Navoi, Sultan Hussein Baqara, Babur, and other people's works, then it would be so much different. Are we running out of time? Okay, so I'm gonna make a last, I'm gonna make conclusion. Let's see. Where Bertels interpreted Navai is a people's poet, embodying proto-socialist values, Western scholars such as Subtelny emphasize his role as both a courtier and a moralist, whose works reflected the tensions between political power, religious ideals, and cultural identity. In this sense, Soviet and Western historiographers mirrored their respective intellectual climate. Soviet scholars subordinated history to the legitimization of socialist ideology, while Western scholars, though not free, were more inclined to foreground aesthetic achievement, cultural agency, and the political significance of patronage. Together, these contrasting traditions reveal how the Timurid legacy has been refracted through divergent ideological prisms in the Soviet Union as a path harness to social progress, and in the West as a cultural renaissance worthy of study on its own terms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gulandom. That was really very interesting, very interesting presentation. Thanks again. So I'm just asking people to raise their hand and ask the question if you want to talk about something or want our speakers to answer some particular question. So there is I think this function is now enabled in our Zoom. But also send your questions in the chat if you prefer that. And I'll start with my questions if I can. So Jaimee, and Gulandom, both of you, this question can be kind of addressed to both of you. This Persian and Turkic kind of divide or not divide, the synergy and the interconnection is very important, and it's very visible in the culture especially. And to be honest, when you just read the history of Central Asia, it is usually assumed that when the Shaybanids came, or as you call them, Abdul Khairids came, they kind of brought more nomadic, more steppe traditions, more influence on the Turkic heritage, and that was kind of more visible in the politics, in the administration, and how visible it was in the culture too, I suppose, because you Gulandom, you talked about Navoi, who was famously, kind of establishing the Chagatai literary traditions. So that was a little bit earlier. But then, how does this kind of interplay, I guess, in the period of the between the dynasties and then the further? So when do we see more kind of Turkic dominance, if I may ask this, or was it ever? I'm not sure. So something kind of to ask you.
Gulandom, do you want to go first? I like this chronological progression. Since you're the 15th century specialist, you can set the scene, and then I'll speak on the 16th.
I will try to answer this question. So as we discussed that Timurid Empire was based mostly on Persian language, and most of the artwork was written in Persian. But when the time came for Sultan Hussein Beqara's period, Alisher Navoi reversed the game, and then he said, no, we're gonna write in Chagatai. So he started writing in Chagatai, and his friend Sultan Hussein Beqara was also writing in Chagatai Turkic language. Zahiruddin Muhammad Babur wrote his memoirs in Chagatai. So Turkic or Chagatai language flourished during last century of Timurid Renaissance. But when Abul Khairids or Shaybanids came to power, they imitated the cultural heritage of Sultan Hussein Baqara. They held majlises, or the gatherings, quarterly gatherings, where the poets and scholars and experts on the literary traditions also had a very distinct atmosphere that was I want to say copied from the Sultan Hussein Baqara's court. And I believe Shaybani Khan very much admired Alisher Navai's work, and he also had some poets that came from Sultan Hussein Baqara's court to serve in Shaybani Khan's court. So this is what I want to say about this. Shaybani Khan himself wrote Shaybani Nama, right? Or
No, well, there were two versions made for him. One in Persian by Banai, and one by Muhammad Saleh in Turkey, in Chagatai.
And they served in Sultan Hussein Baqara's court. Now I'm gonna turn my word to Jaimee.
Yes, thank you so much for that. That setup. I think it's very important to kind of look at the broader picture and see how, just because one dynasty ends, one topples and another emerges, you really see continuity. And so I think Gulandom really attested to that. The things with the abulcated Shaybanids, again, it's my critique that, they've been associated with, Mongol, nomadic, Turkic, as an other to those dynasties in Iran, or as, to distinguish them from the Iranian sector. And so this is partly true early on. So in the first half of the 16th century, because they're only in power for like exactly 99 years. It's very convenient. 1500 to 1599 are their dates of power. So in the early period, yes, power is distributed across these centers, Tashkent, Balkh, Herat at times, Bukhara, Samarkand. But by the time you get to 1557, I didn't mention, the greatest, most powerful ruler, Abdullah Khan. And so it's under him, actually, that power really becomes centralized, and he divorces himself from this older model to really want to launch a dynasty or dynastic succession of his own. Significantly, when we look at the manuscripts, we see that early on, there are more copies of Navoi works, so more Turkic productions being produced. But by the time we get to 1550s, and I should say this is related to illustrated manuscript production, because I'm only focused on those manuscripts with illustrations. 1553 is the last Navoi poetry to be illustrated. You have no more Turkic texts being illustrated at this point. Persian really becomes the dominant lingua franca. So this idea that, the abulcated Shaybanids came and Central Asia becomes, Turkicized, that does not hold.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That's very helpful for me, for my understanding too. But when you speak about, the Iranian, for instance, you spoke that the Anglophiles, scholars, they described the Bukhara style or whatever as provincial. Was it only because it was a kind of a subsidiary, what they saw as of Iranian kind of art, or because, artistically or aesthetically, there were some, they saw some step things, or I don't know, nomadic things or whatever, that they made them provincial?
Oh, that term, it's such a dirty word in art history and, well, in general. I think because the Anglophone scholars were so, their whole focus was on, the arts of Iran, that everything was just part of this, Iran Shash, or, Iran Zamin, which is Persianate. So I guess I would translate that as, the Persianate sphere, which encompasses, good heavens, the Caucasus, through to, the steppes, Kazakhstan, through to, India, Pakistan. So it's this huge expanse. And so if this is considered the, Iranian domain, well, okay, the belly button, the epicenter, is going to be present-day Iranian borders. So to them, that will be the center of production. And then anything on, the outskirts, those are just peripheral too. So I guess it's geographic, but it has this kind of value judgment. Peripheral meaning, derivative copies of, the more courtly, better quality productions of the Iranian center, whether it's, I don't know, Qazvin, Tabriz, Esfahan, Shiraz. But I think it's important to examine groups on their own merits.
Yeah, but I think these debates are still going on. I mean, what is yeah. One more question, just to kind of to clarify the term. Timurid Renaissance. I mean, is it the Renaissance in terms of, I mean, maybe Gulandom can answer. Is this a Renaissance of those Islamic kind of era, the golden era of those scholars, or why do we talk about Renaissance in terms of Timurid epoch?
That's a great question. When we talk about Timurid Renaissance, we see the need of developing of fine arts, architecture, scholarship, debates, scholars flocking from all Islamic centers like Isfahan, Tabriz, Shiraz, and Syria, and Turkey, flocking to Samarkand and Herat later on. During Amr Timur, why it started calling Timurid Renaissance? Because he brought the masters of their works, artisans and craftsmen and people who could make out of those buildings magnificent structures that we see in Samarkand today that brought amazing development to the capital of Timurid Empire. So we can see development of scholarly world, development of the debates among scholars, development of all the amazing architectural, I want to say, designs, and continuing throughout the Sultan Hussein Baqar's time. So in Sultan Hussein Baqar's time, that came to the culmination or to the need of the development. As Dr. Subtelny says, there were calligraphers and countless manuscript production and artisans and craftsmen and people who really did their job with amazing with amazing talent. So that brings us to the notion that it was Herat during Sultan Hussein Baqara was the center of civilization at that time, the center of Islamic growth, mathematics, theology, astronomy, all those beautiful medieval sciences developed in Herat, and all the scholars wanted to come and establish their lives there because the patronage was very well organized. Scholars and students who went to universities, which is madrasas, and studied their scholarly degrees were provided by stipends. So everything was provided for scholarly world and poetry and all this quarterly gatherings among scholars were just amazingly developed.
Could I add, this is, coming out of, the Mongol conquest. So, power has shifted from Ilkhanid Baghdad that gets, I don't want to say destroyed, but, well, yes, destroyed by the armies of Genghis Khan. And then, in that aftermath, other dynasties sprout up, such as the Timurids that will flourish. So I think the Mongols unfairly get a bad reputation, but look at what evolves from these conquests, from these subsequent dynasties.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Yes. I'll just ask the audience whether somebody wants to ask them any questions, because I have only one question in the chat. Anybody wants to raise their hand? All right. So I'll just ask, I guess, this last question from the chat, and I add something of my own again. So the question is, I guess, because, it's really, I mean, this is a very rich heritage, visual heritage, and we see these miniatures and we are really amazed. And especially, I'm always amazed by the image of Genghis Khan, who is always in a kind of Persian Arabic kind of form. But since everything is so visual, how do we, how do we organize our museums? How do we organize our cultural kind of communication, especially in Central Asia? I think you said, Jaimee, that in your conclusion that the tradition is still going on to kind of separate the cultural heritage and all that. And do you see any signs of kind of writing, of a new writing of an interconnected history in terms of cultural history in Central Asia, especially now as the countries are kind of comparing with each other?
Gosh, I really hope there's more interconnectivity and exchange. Well, next week I'll be flying to Tashkent. They have the new Center for Islamic Civilizations, and they've asked me to come to kind of inspect their presentation, their exhibition of Timurid holdings and I guess post-Timurid. So I'm very curious to see what they are doing. I do hope they listen to my suggestions. They may very well just go off and do their own thing, which they're entitled to do. It's their funding. But if they want to take this seriously and with academic input, I think they would be keen to contextualize the region, and really from the outset they should just state that this is not Uzbek, this is not solely Tajik, this is not Kyrgyz, this is not Kazakh, and can avoid that type of terminology. But I think phrasing, display of objects, yes, of course, but how they are presented, how they are interpreted to the public is very important. So I'm a little apprehensive, actually.
I agree. Gulandom, do you want to add something? Or
Yes, I want to add one more thing that I forgot to mention about Timurid Renaissance. Why scholars have so much interest in Timurid Renaissance? Why we call it Timurid Renaissance? Because as Bartold said, it's not a lack of resources that we are searching for. It's so much resources from the Timurid era that we don't have enough scholars to go through all of the manuscripts that were produced. So my point is, during Timurid era, especially during Shahrukh Mirza and his sons, Baysungur Mirza and Ibrahim Sultan, and then Sultan Hussein Baqara, the last Timurid who ruled Herat, the mass production of manuscripts were seen, and then it was kind of spread around Islamic centers of the neighboring countries. And now we also see that next generation after the Timurids try to copy that cultural courtly manners. They try to copy the manuscript production. They try to imitate the era of Sultan Hussein Baqara, because it was just flourishing with arts, innovative manuscript production, fine arts. And when we go to Metropolitan Art Museum, we see the examples of Timurid Empire, to Shaybanid Empire, Abul Khairid Empire. We see from Mughal Empire, where Babur Mirza established Mughal dynasty. When we go to the Sackler Gallery Museum, we also see amazing examples of Ulughbek Mirza, which was son of Shahrukh Mirza. And then it is just an amazing mass production of arts and manuscripts that were spread around the world. And we can see that all over the libraries and fonts and museums around the world now, especially in the West.
yeah, it's true. Yeah, well, it's very interesting. Thank you very much, Jaimee and Gulandom. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentations. It was really a pleasure having you here at the Central Asia program. We wish you all the best in your research and your trips, and we hope to see more of that research in public. We hope to see more and better museums and, more visual representation of Central Asia. And yeah, I just have one question here in the chat. Would it be possible to receive Gulandom's email address? I can, if you don't mind, I can share your contacts. And on that note, I think I just want to thank everybody for your participation. I hope you found this event interesting. I hope to see you back with new findings, new research, and thank you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for organizing this. Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for your attention.